Okay, so this video is all about the idea of change over time. And if you're studying your A-levels or studying GCSEs, you may be studying a time period of about a century. And in quite a few exam boards, they'll have, looking at a particular period, say Germany 1918 to 1991, kind of a German century, if you will, or the Middle East, from the Balfour Declaration all the way through to the Oslo Accords, 1917 to 1994. And the idea with these is that some kind of historical process really has happened throughout that time period. Now, there's got to be a way of writing exam papers so that you, or essays, so that you don't wind up writing a long, boring, turgid historical narrative that's going to make the examiner pray for an early death, basically. So how do we do it? Well, the first thing is that what you're not doing in that exam paper or essay is telling the story. The examiner knows the story. If we're talking about the story of Russia from 1917 to 1991, throughout the entire period of communism, that we know the story. Or if we don't, we can look on Wikipedia. It's easy. You're not required to do narrative. If you're getting into a habit of writing and then, stop. Because the essay will not be asking you ever what happened. It'll be saying, to what extent was economics, or to what extent was the terror the main cause of events of change over time in this period. And so everything you're doing, you need to be doing from an evaluative standpoint. To what extent was economics the main factor that changed history in the Soviet Union throughout the 20th century? To what extent was it the use of terror? To what extent was it war? It's a country that's been invaded several times. And you need to be able to evaluate the significance of different factors competing with one another over time. This is automatically going to make your essay a lot more interesting, certainly. And the trick with it is always to start from a sound basis. Now, the reason why people come a cropper with these kinds of essays all the time and slip back into boring narrative, telling the story, blah, 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 is because they don't start from a firm, argumentative standpoint, i.e. what they're saying from the get-go doesn't really make any sense, or they're not really saying anything. So there isn't a position that they are working towards from their introduction. So you've got to get a bit opinionated here. There are far too few argumentative history students out there. In your essays, you need to be taking a standpoint, obviously one that you can support. There's no use you trying to argue things for argument's sake if they don't stand up, if they don't make sense, if they are kind of ill-conceived. And the way that you are able to create a strong standpoint from in your essays is by decent reading. Your teacher might not always equip you with enough to read. The majority of classroom teachers will give you handouts. They will give you photocopies from textbooks. They will not equip you with a school text. School budgets have been slashed so heavily that, say for example, an actual book on the subject of the Soviet Union or Germany in the 20th century, the schools will very rarely provide you with that one. So if you want those top marks, if you want to be really pushing back the boundaries and going for that A star, you need to be the reader. Now, I provide something of a little free gratis service to all students that really want to do more, want to really challenge themselves and push back the boundaries and learn more, but they don't know where to start. It's called emailing me and I'll tell you. So If you're out there and you're studying Germany in the 20th century, or Russia in the 20th century, or another synoptic study, or anything at all really, email me and I will always be able to find a good book for the time period that you are talking about. Reading is something of an art form. Seems like a strange thing to say, but it actually is. There are so few students today in the UK, perhaps even in the world, that read one book cover to cover throughout the course of their entire A-level, and this is a travesty, it's a tragedy, and it's something that we really need to address. If you're capable of doing this, you are streaks ahead of the opposition. You are absolutely light years ahead of the opposition if you can read one book cover to cover on the subject that you're studying, and understand it in its entirety as its whole, and be able to understand the historian's arguments that run through the book. Because again, this is something that you will probably need to incorporate. I mean, obviously look at your assessment objectives for the essay. This is something you'll probably need to incorporate in your essay. If we were looking at why the Soviet Union developed as it did over a long period of time, obviously a variety of historians will have a variety of opinions on this subject, and knowing at least a couple of those opinions will make all the difference, and knowing whether those opinions are well received. And not all historians' opinions are. Some historians' opinions have been outdated by others. Others were ludicrous back in the day, and even more so now. And so it's important to know, isn't it, that an idea is either well received or not, or it is considered to be old hat or not. We wouldn't go around repeating things to our friends that had been previously rubbished and discredited. It would look really foolish. And the same thing is true in an essay. And these days, with the abundance of information at our fingertips, it's quite easy to find out what people think of a particular historian, whether what they have to say is valid or not. You can literally Google that one away. So, firstly, going back to our original point, you need to have an argument, and an argument comes from knowledge, and the knowledge comes from reading, but you certainly need to have an opinion. As you go through your essay on studying a synoptic period, a century or so, looking for themes of change over time, we're really focusing on why change happens at all. What are the main drivers of change? Very rarely it can be put down to really one individual. Most contemporary historical thinking would suggest that bigger forces such as economic change, globalization, unemployment, nationalism, war, these sorts of things, religion, these sorts of things that impact on the lives of many millions of people. These are the real drivers of change in the modern era. Sure, there are people such as David Lloyd George or Adolf Hitler or Lenin or Joseph Chamberlain or whoever, who seem to be able to steer events at particular times, but they are equally subject to these massive forces of change: economic, social, religious, cultural, political, military, that shape our world in the way that it does, and very often that overpower people and overpower societies and leave them helpless. So those are the kinds of forces you need to be evaluating and comparing and contrasting in your essays, and being able to look at evidence that supports the idea that a particular force, say for example economic change in the Soviet Union, caused the most change, upheaval, change over time. You need to be able to present evidence that that is indeed the case. So if you were to look at, say, the Soviet 5-year plans or the stagnation period of the 1960s and 70s, simply presenting that as evidence isn't enough unless you're actually evaluating that evidence, unless you're analysing it and showing what the evidence you have presented actually means. then you're not really going to get the most out of what you're doing. So a way of doing that is looking at your piece of evidence, making a point, saying, I believe that in the 1970s that the most significant factor was the fact that the economy was stagnating. Okay, show some evidence. You say, well, inflation went up like this, and it had this effect on society, and then draw out a judgment from that. And you can say, well, overall, therefore, this shows us that this was, the main factor at the time. I mean, there were other factors, things like the Cold War and, growing religious tension and nationalism across the empire. But really, it's economic. And there you draw out your judgment. And then you can then easily link into the next paragraph. And in coming weeks, I will look a bit more about linking between paragraphs and some of the tricks of the trade we can use. But to really cap this little video off, I would reiterate that getting away from narrative storytelling and getting into analysis, that all begins with the introduction. I've done millions of things on this YouTube video channel and on my podcast on introductions, but I'll try and add some more in the near future. There's a bunch of stuff on my website as well, www.explaininghistory.com, on introductions. Start off with a solid introduction, and then analysis will tend to kind of take care of itself, but we shall focus on that soon. Anyway, thanks, bye-bye.